judgment then.
I just have a couple minutes, but I thought I'd introduce Dr. Joe Sargent, who is a wonderful musicologist and the leading Sowerby scholar from Alabama. But it's been a great privilege to get to know Joe over the last few years. We collaborated on some Sowerby stuff, and we had him a couple of years ago for the Sowerby anniversary song that we did. So I don't know what time Stephen's going to have you get started, maybe in a few minutes, but I just thought I would do introductions now for it.
Okay, that sounds great. Yeah, thank you, Stephen.
Fortunately, Stephen's going to be recording it, so.
All right, reserved for posterity.
I bet some more folks will be tripling in as the morning.
Okay, thank you.
Cooler than Alabama.
So we got to do a quick introduction and then, yeah.
I'm telling y'all, we've been joking about this. I'm actually from Massachusetts, so this is not too strange to me, this weather. But you could have done a little bit. Could have done a little bit warmer, maybe.
We could go a little bit.
But it's all right. I've got a pair of gloves in there that I haven't used in like 5 years, so it was nice to bring them out here and do all this. So can we get started, or I don't know if I'm waiting for the recording to start. Are we okay to get started?
All right, yeah, we might as well. There'll be some more folks probably joining in, but we don't want to hold you too long.
Wonderful, okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. This is my second time being at St. James Cathedral. It's a real privilege and honor to be here. This is not me, that's me, Dr. Joseph Sargent. I'm a music historian. I'm a professor at the University of Alabama down in Tuscaloosa, where it's about 50 degrees warmer now than it is here probably today. And one of my main areas of interest as a scholar is Leo Sowerby, who of course was one of the main musical figures at this cathedral. And as you all celebrate your 150th anniversary, Stephen Busard was very kind enough to have me come up here and to talk to you a little bit about Sowerby and St. James. Is he someone you know at all, first of all? You probably hear his music here a decent amount, I would imagine. Okay. I will try to pitch the level of the musical stuff so that it's accessible but not too obscure or anything like that. But I do want to talk about at least my thoughts on Sowerby and his relationship to this cathedral. And the way I'd like to frame this is to kind of look at it from two perspectives, right? Number one, what Sowerby did for this place as a musician, what kind of impact. In the big picture, what kind of impact did he have on this cathedral? And then the second area is how the cathedral impacted him, because I think it impacted him very profoundly, I think, as a musician and as a human being as well. So these are the kind of strands I want to talk about today. And I'll go through various aspects of Sowerby's life, his biography, and for each of these, I'm going to orient my thoughts anyway around a couple key bullet points that I think are important. And we'll talk about how those all work out. Okay. But before we do this, I think we need to know who Sowerby was before he came here, right? Okay. Sowerby was 32 years old when he joined the staff here at St. James. But he had a long kind of career before coming here. And a career that was in quite a different direction, actually, from what he ended up doing here as a cathedral musician. So in order to kind of lay the foundation, I want to give you a little bit of background about who this guy is and what his life was like before he came to St. James, right? And so I give you a couple key points on here. May 1st, 1895 is his birthday. He was born in Grand Rapids, Michigan. That's not too far from here, I don't think, right? Born and raised there, moved here at age 14 to study music. Sowerby's initial interest was in being a pianist and a composer. Not necessarily a church musician, right? He was more interested in his early life in being a kind of a concert figure in a lot of ways. So he studied at what was the American Conservatory, was one of the big conservatories here. I think it closed down in the 60s or something like that. He studied piano there, was a very serious piano student. Kind of picked up organ on the side. It wasn't his main thing, basically, right there. This is Sowerby at home at the piano. It's a little daunting. These are all famous composers. So I think that's Bach and maybe Chopin and Schumann and Liszt. And they're kind of like the looming figures looking down at him, telling him he must keep practicing, or something like that. but that's a little bit of who he is, right? He makes a big splash at just 18 years old when the Chicago Symphony here performs his violin concerto. So right away, he's kind of seen as this budding concert figure, right? A few years later, you see on here this other slide, he gets Vic Symphony to do a whole program of his own music. So as a concert figure, his stock is really rising, even as a young artist, right? And this is what he is. He's a pianist and he's a composer mostly in concert music. Now he does play organ. He has some organ gigs on the side. He played at Fourth Presbyterian, which I think is kind of right around the corner from here, right? That was one of his early organ church jobs with Eric de la Martyr, who was one of his big mentors there. But if you talk about Sowerby in the 1920s, you're not talking about him as this famous church musician or church composer. He's really interested in folk music. He loves writing concert pieces based on folk ideas. He's into jazz. He writes a couple jazz pieces. Do you know who Paul Whiteman is by any chance? I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Paul. What's that?
Orchestra leader?
Yeah, that's right. Kind of a, the
Big
symphonic
band.
orchestra. That's right, in the 1920s. So he wrote a couple pieces for the orchestra. He even toured with them for a little bit. He was in the military. This is him in uniform, right? Served in France for a little less than a year, I think. He lived in Rome for 3 years. He was the first American winner of what's called the Rome Prize. This is a very prestigious composition competition, basically. You win this prize, they pay for you to live in Rome for 3 years and be in this beautiful villa and do nothing but compose and get your music performed. Boy, wouldn't I love a life like that. Beautiful. He learns Italian. He really appreciates the culture and everything like that. He comes back here and he teaches at the American Conservatory. So until Sowerby was about 30, 31, 32 years old, he wasn't much of a church musician, actually. I mean, he did play organ in churches. He did compose some church music. It's not like he didn't do any of it. But it wasn't the central point of his life in many ways. And this place is what changes them, basically. Because he comes here on May 1st, 1927, his birthday. He got hired. His first day here was his birthday, his 32nd birthday, right? And there he is over there. That's kind of an iconic image of Sowerby at your organ here, right? And he joins as the organist and the choir master. Right? And he stayed for a long time, 3.5 decades, grew right through the 60s. And it was this place that more than anything else provided both for Sowerby as a musician and as a person. It provided a kind of sense of stability that he hadn't really had in his life before. And so, in many ways, the Episcopalian Church becomes his home in a lot of ways. And as you see on this last bullet point, he does a lot of things for the church besides just working here, right? He's on these church music commissions. He's writing hymns for your hymnal, the 1940 hymnal, which was the big one back in the day. It's funny. You probably used the 1982 hymnal, I imagine, here? Okay. There are some, there's a volume of essays that accompanies that book. And they actually throw a little shade at Sowerby in those essays. One of the authors saying that they thought Sowerby was too elitist and we needed to bring some more popular music elements into that. Just a sign of how the times have kind of changed over the years. But during his own lifetime, he was very heavily involved in that hymnal. I mean, he not only composed many hymns for it, but was choosing what other music was going to be involved. He was chairing committees on all of that. For many years, he taught summer school. He taught choir boy camps and things like that. He taught one out in Colorado for many years. And then later up in Ohio, he did another one. So, kind of suddenly, the church becomes very important to Sowerby, right? And we'll talk, in the latter half of this talk, I'll give you a little bit more detail on how that plays out in his personal life. But in the meantime, let's start with Sowerby and his impact on St. James. What does he do here? Right? In my humble opinion, there are 3 key areas that he makes an impact musically on this place. And I've kind of given you these brief points here. elevating the musical standards, number one, the quality of the organ making, of organ playing, quality of the choir sound, things like that. Those kind of standards certainly goes up once he's here. Enhancing its liturgies musically. He starts to write a whole bunch of music to be sung here in your liturgies. And he's very concerned that that music is of the highest quality. So it's a big change in his compositional direction, law-wise. And thirdly, he kind of exchanged what I call a cultural magnet. This becomes kind of a place where if you want to hear good music, you come here, right? It becomes a bit of a center for that in a way that maybe it hadn't been before. So let's see how all of these play out. Right? And we'll start with kind of the idea of elevating musical standards. Right? Many of you have probably seen this image before. I don't know. This is a famous image of the choir. This is a stage image. This isn't the image. This isn't the singers in action. This is them posing right up there. Right. This is a famous picture of there's Sowerby, right, and there's the choir singing from 1937. Sowerby was very crucial in elevating the quality of your choir, the quality of the music that was happening here. Prior to him coming here, there had been a guy, his last name was Norton, or something like that. He'd been around for a long time and he'd done a good job, but he kind of went away and they had this other guy come in for about a year and a half. And he was kind of a disaster, is what we kind of have figured. He kind of let things go. He didn't care as much about how the choir sounded, things like that. Sowerby is not that guy. Sowerby comes in and he gets things in order. He's a little bit of a dictator about it. He is very much a taskmaster the way he treats it. He's inspired by, as I say, after the English choral tradition. I don't know if you ever listened to English cathedral choirs or happen to know anything about it. They have this long, really fantastic tradition of really high-level music making. Lots of men and boys choirs back in the day. Now it's much more integrated gender-wise, but a lot of very high standards, which I know Stephen Musar does here as well, because the last time I was here, I actually sat in and sang with his choir. Oh yeah, he's very, very good. Taking that as a model for this choir that wasn't really used to having to absolutely show up. If you're 1 minute late, they shut the door and you can't come into the rehearsal. He literally did this. He would pay you differently if you were one of the paid singers, depending on how valuable you were. You had to earn your money literally as a singer. He was a taskmaster. He didn't suffer fools gladly, right? There are stories about him even saying, when you all, I'm sure, had an experience, there's some kind of prayer being said, and then you all sing, Amen, at the end of that. Sowerby would be like, oh, man. He's literally directing we all know how to sing Amen, you would think, right? But no, he has to kind of tell you, here's the here's the man, right? Very, very particular about that, right? I say also here that he has this choral song that's also very kind of Midwestern in a way. Stephen Musar can probably tell you more about this. I don't know if any of you were here. Was it 3 months ago or so? I think Stephen gave one of these forum talks. I don't know if anybody happened to be here for that. But he talks about this. You can go back on YouTube and find it. He talks about this, about how standards for choral singing are different now than they were in the 1930s, let's say. A lot of us and I do a lot of professional choral singing, a lot of us think of qualities like intonation and blend and all these kind of smooth qualities that create this kind of pristine sound is often what we kind of think is an ideal choral sound. That wasn't necessarily what Sowerby did at all. It's actually much more individual. There's, you would hear voices stick out probably a little bit more. If we would sing a line like in a kind of like horizontal way, like da 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 da, where you're kind of starting and rising and falling. That's often a way that we think would be a nice way to sing a line in a choral piece. Sowerby might be like, dun, 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 dun. You know, it's a very different aesthetic, the way he thinks about this stuff. But that's not a value judgment, because at that time, this is how people were thinking about choral singing. And it was very successful. His choir dramatically improved in quality for all of this. Right? It's very tight management of singers. We've already talked about that a little bit, right? Shutting the door if you don't make it to rehearsal, that's it's a little harsh, but that's all right. Emphasizing high quality repertory also. What kind of music are you going to sing in the choir? Are you going to sing just kind of easy, sentimental pieces? Or are you going to try to be challenging in terms of advanced difficulty and technical requirements for this concept? Sowerby's going to be one of those people who makes pretty high demands, not just on the choir, but in the congregation as well, you know, because you're the ones who are worshiping to this music and you're hearing it. You know, that might not be to everybody's taste all the time, but Sowerby was uncompromising in this way. This is a quote from one of his former students, Robert Raphael. There was always a waiting list to sing with this fine musician, who was hard on them too, right? And exactly the last ounce of effort with perfection, the goal. This is really true. People started to take notice of this. It wasn't too long before people realized, oh, something is happening at St. James. They're doing some good stuff, right? This is a quote from an article that was published in 1932 in a journal called the Musical Times. A guy named H.L. Morrow. He writes, in 4 years at St. James, Mr. Sowerby has built up from obscurity a choir that has absorbed the traditional English spirit and style of singing. Much has been said about the standard of American church music, and by this he means much has been said about the low standard of American church music. But here, at all events, is a choir which is certainly winning distinction. The superiority of English choral singing has for so long been taken for granted that it may be surprising to find the nucleus of a serious challenge in our own particular style. Here we go, now there's an American choir that's living up to the highest standards of England, which is often considered kind of the gold standard, right, of choral singing. In just 4 years, you've got a choir here that's doing it, right? It's a nice testament to the real impact Sowerby had on the music program here. Here's another little anecdote about Sowerby and his kind of single-mindedness during rehearsals. This was much later. This is a recollection from the early 21st century. Leo had a most intense one-track concentration. He could not be moved by any potential distraction. One night at rehearsal, he was announcing plans for the choir to sing at St. Luke's nurse's graduation. Being on an off night, it might not have been possible for all to attend. As he was explaining the details, he paused for just a moment, during which a bass popped up with an anguished cry, "But I'm getting married that day!" Leo never heard him, but immediately continued, "And if you can't come, go get a substitute." And then everybody starts laughing, and he has no idea. He's so focused on what he's doing, you know, he's a little bit oblivious to what happens around him sometimes. But I think it's a cute little anecdote. And it's a testament to really the focus and concentration and serious-mindedness with which Sowerby took his music-making duties here at St. James. An example of it right up there, too. One of the other ways that Sowerby affected St. James was in terms of the sheer amount of music he wrote to be sung here. Right? As I say here, St. James decisively shaped the direction of Sowerby's creativity, focusing his efforts on its specific liturgies. It's pretty remarkable. You can go through the Sowerby catalog and kind of year by year and see all the music that he's written. Up until 1927, which is when he joins here, all right, he's got some hymns, he's got a couple organ pieces, things like that, but he's not doing it systematically at all. It's mixed in with all that folk stuff, all that symphonic stuff, everything else. Okay. He comes here and he gets down to business and he starts writing music that could be sung at this space. It's very, very distinctive. He writes various canticles. Do you know what these words are? The Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis. Okay. These two are texts that you would sing during the evensong service, right, in the afternoon. These other canticles, Benedictus and Te Deum Laudamus, those are for kind of a morning prayer service, right, matins. And then, of course, the communion service of the Mass, right? Okay. What you see Sowerby doing in these years, 1927 to 1930, he gets here and he starts writing systematically music to be sung in this space for every single possible outlet, right? And by the end of 1930, he's done. He's written a complete suite, almost, of music that you could sing at any service here at St. James. That's pretty distinctive. That's pretty remarkable. For somebody who was writing symphonies and concertos and sonatas and all that kind of stuff, the fact that he really turns his focus to this place is really, really fascinating to me. And so now, in just a couple short years, you've got all this new music being sung here that you didn't have before. And he doesn't stop there, by the way. He keeps going. He keeps writing music. Hymns, canticles, things like that, cantatas, anthems, all these kind of things, throughout his time here. St. James is in many ways a pivot in terms of how Sowerby thinks of himself as a composer. Before coming here, he was a concert music composer who wrote sacred music, sometimes. That shifts as he comes here. Now, he's a sacred music composer who writes concert music. And at the beginning, it's kind of balanced between the two, but then as he stays here longer and longer, the sacred music comes more and more important. The concert music, less and less. It's a real fascinating arc in his history as a composer. And it's because of this space. It's because of the people here and the music that's happening here. To the point that he's now, maybe you've heard this title, the Dean of American Church Music. This gets thrown around with Sowerby a lot. It's thanks to his work here that he has that. I mean, to this day, I mean, I would maybe still argue, I mean, Sowerby has been gone for 57 years or so, but I'm not sure there's anybody who has really picked up that mantle in terms of being a real icon of American church music that Sowerby was. We should listen to a little bit of this, don't you think? Do any of you know this piece, this Magnificat Nunc in D? Okay. I'm going to play a little bit for you. It's going to have a score rolling on. I'm not going to ask you to, if you don't read music, that's fine. But there's something interesting I want to show you. This was uploaded by the Leo Sowerby Foundation. There's a foundation devoted to him. And they have this copy of the score that's got his own handwritten notes in it. So I think it's kind of neat to see this, and we'll get this started in just 1 minute. But these are Sowerby's accents, that's Sowerby's handwriting. It's like that. There'll be more of them on the next page. So this is the printed copy, right? But it's also showing him use this. You can use these kind of scores to get an idea of what he values as a musician. What should the organ manuals be? How should we articulate these things? I mean, even if you don't know what those symbols mean, it's not. I mean, that's fine. It's not a big deal. But these are great opportunities for us to see who he was as a musician in a lot of ways, right? Okay. And so we'll listen to just a little bit of this. I want to play the whole thing, but we don't. I love this piece. I think it's a beautiful piece. One of the things I love about Sowerby's music is how closely he matches words with music and really tries to create music that expresses the meaning of the word. For instance, oops. Oh no. That's all right. For he hath regarded the lowliness of his handmaid. This is, do you know what the Magnificat text is? It's about Mary discovering that she's going to bear the Son of God, this humble handmaiden having this great, profound role. And he writes it just in the sopranos, so it's just a female voice, you know what I mean? Being speaking, because it's talking about Mary, her kind of humility, right? For behold, all of a sudden it's bigger and more dramatic, and the men come in, right? Because that's an exciting moment, right? And it gets really reverent on the next page when he talks about, and holy is his name, right? There's been all this exciting music here that I've been magnified, and holy is his name. And the music kind of slows down, and it's sweet and soft. An effort to match the mood of the words, right, with music. This is what Sowerby does routinely. It's one of his real achievements as a church music composer. Good. You can find this on YouTube if you want to get more of it. Okay. The last thing that Sowerby does, in terms of how he impacts St. James, is that he makes this space a kind of cultural magnet. Number one, by sponsoring this organ recital series. We have an organ recital this afternoon, right? And if you're not sick of me by now, you'll hear me talk a little bit more about Sowerby at that point as well. Guest organists are coming. Very renowned guest organists are coming to play your organ in this space. And people in your community are taking notice. And it becomes kind of a social event to come here. Where are you going to go if you want to hear real high quality church music? Oh, go to the cathedral. And so there are notices and like society pages about the organ recitals happening here, right? It becomes kind of a draw, right? For a certain type of educated, informed, musician, listener, things like that. The social elite, right? It's also a cultural magnet because besides Sowerby's own music, the stuff that he's programming for the choir is very high quality. The best composers from the Renaissance and the Baroque and the classical and the Romantic eras, right? He's not just putting kind of simplistic kind of music into the choir. They're going to sing really quality music, difficult music in a lot of ways. So if you're a parishioner and you want to hear that high quality music, again, this is where you're going to come probably, because Sowerby's going to be putting it out there week after week. This is a place where many of his own most important works were premiered as well. This is a cantata called Forsaken of Men, which you're going to have being sung here later this year. This is it's a Holy Week cantata. It's a passion cantata, basically, about the last days of Jesus. And I was very, very excited to learn recently from Stephen Buzard that the choir is going to be doing it here in a few months, right, for Holy Week. So these are large-scale, big pieces. I mean, this is about over an hour long, this passion. This is like monumental kind of significant artistic statements in some ways, you know what I mean? And it's happening here. And it's outside the normal cycle of masses, you know what I mean? These are distinct events as well. And so in this way, I see St. James as both a guardian of musical history and a nexus for contemporary music, right? It kind of blends them both, the past and the present, in very, very unique ways. Let's listen to a little bit of Forsaken of Men. This is a taste of what you're going to get in about 3 months, 2 or 3 months here. heard the William Ferris chorale? When I was here 18 months ago, they happened to be doing a concert that weekend, so Stephen invited me to go. They're very, very good. If you ever have a chance, you should go to them. William Ferris was one of Sowerby's students, one of his last students, actually, and then he founded his own chorale, among other things, and they're still singing to this day. They're a very high-quality choir. It might be worth checking out. When Sowerby writes a piece like this, I've just played you a minute, so I'm not expecting you to kind of instantly understand everything about it, but can you think of other composers in history who like to write these kind of cantatas? If there's one famous composer in musical history writing cantatas, yes, this is who I would think too, right? I think when Sowerby writes these pieces, he's conscious of that tradition, right? Because we have, if you've ever heard the St. Matthew Passion, for instance, or the St. John Passion, you have an evangelist character, right, who's a tenor, which you also have here. You have a soloist who sings the role of Jesus, who's a bass, and you have that here as well. I think, my personal opinion is that Sowerby has Bach in mind in many ways when he's writing a piece like this. Now, it doesn't sound like Bach, he's doing it in his own language, things like that. But it's an important node of connection. Okay. So with all of that said, I want to think now, actually, I have one more quote for you, which I really think, this is a really nice quote, I actually think, because it really encapsulates a lot of the things that I've said here. This is a letter to Sowerby from a guy named Leonard Ellenwood. Ellenwood was a musicologist, a hymnologist in Washington, D.C. He was at Washington National Cathedral there. Which is, by the way, where Sowerby moved. For the last few years of his life, Sowerby actually moved to Washington, D.C. and had this community. But this is being written in 1952. They had a celebration here of Sowerby's 20 years of service, 25 years, pardon me, of service. And Ellenwood writes the following to Leo. Dear Leo, we sang your Forsaken of Man as usual again on Passion Sunday. On Palm Sunday, Paul Calloway played your prelude on King's Majesty. Easter at Evensong, we used your studying of the Canticles, repeating the Nunc Dimittis this afternoon when the Annapolis Naval Academy Choir was here and sang a musical service. Next Sunday, we are using your studying of the Jubilate Deo, and so it goes on here month after month, as in an increasing number of choirs throughout the Anglican world. What a far cry all this is from the situation 25 years ago, when I was fresh out of college and you were beginning your years of service at St. James. Since then, your choir, your compositions, and your teaching have played a principal role in affecting the transformation which has taken place in so much of American church music. People took notice of Sowerby, not only here in Chicago, nationwide. Right? In his time here, Sowerby, I believe he made St. James, one of the real central nodes for exciting, important music making in American church music. I think there's no denying this is one of the most really highest quality top centers. As it remains today, actually, because you have one of the best musicians in the nation right now, in my own opinion, leading your choir and playing your organ. He was really seminal, I think, in establishing that tradition, which we still have here to this day. Okay. So with all of this said, how did St. James affect Sowerby? That's what I want to think about now for the last 15 minutes or so. And again, I give us a couple points of what I think are important in this respect. On a personal level, this place absolutely deepened his kind of personal spirituality, his faith as an Episcopalian. Sowerby actually wasn't an Episcopalian before he came here. He certainly was, by the time he left, he was certainly an extremely devout person. So this cathedral had a profound impact on his faith, on his spirituality. It had a profound impact as well on his philosophical and theological views on church music. We're going to see in about 5 or 10 minutes. Sowerby talks a lot about what he thinks church music should be. And it's not just like artistically, you know what I mean? It's not just, oh, I like these instruments or I like this sound. It's about theology. It's about what music should do in a church and how it should enhance the worshiper and how it should glorify God. It is very theologically minded what he thinks about these things. And so we'll talk very briefly about what a couple of those ideas are. But that's something he didn't have at all before he came here. This is St. James impacting him. And finally, on a more strictly musical level, this cathedral reinvigorates its energies toward organ music. And a lot, for instance, everything you'll hear this afternoon in Stephen Musard's recital comes from what he wrote here. We'll talk a little bit about exactly how that reinvigoration happens. But I want to get through a couple of these ideas first. I think this is important to this first point up here, in terms of deepening personal convictions. You know, Sowerby wasn't particularly religious before he came here. Now, he had grown up, his stepmother was a Christian Scientist, so he had had exposure to religious faith as a young boy. And of course, he's working in churches, he's working, I mean, it wasn't an absence of religion necessarily in his life. But in terms of personal faith, it wasn't a real central part of his life until he came here. So he joins the cathedral here in 1927. 3 months ago, when Stephen Musard gave his talk here, he gave a little amusing anecdote about how it was lunchtime, and Sowerby programs this hymn that's got a whole bunch of alleluias, 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 and someone had to come talk to him and say, like, you can't do that during Lent. Like, you need to learn a little bit about how the liturgy works. You need to learn about these things. So he goes to England for 3 months, actually, and absorbs the Anglican tradition. So he didn't, I mean, he had some exposure, but it wasn't quite as deep, right? He comes here, and it's a big difference. He gets confirmed as an Episcopalian 1 year after he joins, right? So he actually formally joins the faith, right? And this absolutely leads to what many of us describe as a more reverent approach to his music. He's writing church music with a different mindset, a different purpose, you know? It's not just about, you know, fulfilling a commission or, you know, giving something that they can have play at the church, but it's more about articulating a particular kind of religious vision or a kind of, you know, personal theology about what this music should be doing. It's a deeper engagement with the whole idea of church music. Right? Very, very fascinating. We'll look at a couple quotes that talk about this. And of course, socially also, he develops very close ties to his singers here. And this becomes his community on a very personal level. These are his people as he joins the choir, as he joins the cathedral and all of that. It becomes in many ways the anchor of his life. Now, Sowerby was someone who had lived in Rome for a while. He had been in the army. He'd kind of been doing all these different kinds of things. I feel like he finds his home in a lot of ways when he comes here. And so we'll look at a couple of supporting examples of how this plays out. This is an article that Sowerby wrote in 1958, based on a speech that he gave. And I just pulled out a little bit of a quote here to articulate some of these things. He says in here, he's talking about what you should be doing. If you're a church musician, like, what's your job as a church musician, right? Is basically the central subject of this article. It's a long article, you can see. But here's, in many ways, what I think is the crux of it. The successful organist will have developed a sense of and feeling for the service itself. And this can only be done properly by one who has a love for and understanding of the liturgical service and its significance. You have to be in it in order to understand it, I think, is what Sowerby is saying. You know, right? That's not an attitude I think he would have had in 1925, something like that. This is something that has developed over years of experience in this particular space. This is just for fun. Just to show Sowerby's community. This is a bunch of Sowerby's choir members at on the beach. So Sowerby owned a summer cottage up in Michigan, on the other side of the coast of Lake Michigan. All right, and I thought this was just cute to kind of humanize Sowerby a little bit. You know, we're so used to these kind of pictures, this kind of serious, like noble kind of pictures of Sowerby. Well, you know, he was a human being also. You know, he liked to have fun sometimes. And there he is. I don't know if you can tell, but that's him. With a bunch of his choir members, right? So, again, this is his community. I think I have sung in church choirs for many, many years. I think any of us who have ever done this understand that it's more than just singing in an ensemble. It really is a community in many ways. So we have that with Sowerby as well. One of the other things this place does for Sowerby is it crystallizes his philosophical or theological views on church music, right? this gets manifested in lots of ways, especially starting in kind of like the post-World War II era, let's say after 1945. Sowerby starts going to conferences a lot and giving talks and writing pamphlets and writing articles. He becomes an important statesman on music and the church. So it's not just that he's believing it in his heart, but he's going out and kind of expressing these views. And we have several examples of this, including this pamphlet here, Ideas in Church Music, which he wrote in 1956. And it's through these we get a sense of how passionate Sowerby is about what proper church music should be. And I give you some of the common themes that appear in his writings. Great respect for tradition and authority, first of all. The great musical tradition that we've had in sacred music. Bach is number one, Bach more than anybody else probably, but also the great English Renaissance composers, other kinds of figures. This is this hallowed tradition that we should keep and sustain as we're going through. But he's frustrated, as I say here, with what he calls the age of the individualists. I shouldn't just go to some church and do things my way, because that's the way I want to do it. That's the individualist, I should be mindful of what our faith asks us to do, what the institutional history of our church thinks about these things, and rather than just going rogue, so to speak, right, and just doing things my own way, I need to be mindful of the tradition that I'm in, and I need to be respectful of that tradition. Sowerby was very kind of frustrated sometimes that he would go to these other churches, and they're just doing things that are completely opposite to what the Episcopal Church tells you should be doing. And, I've got my own reason for doing this, and they'll say like that, but that's a real problem for him. Right? You should conform to kind of official Episcopal musical and liturgical policies, even if you don't necessarily like it. He talks about this in the 1940 hymnal, for instance. Not everybody's going to love every tune in heaven. I mean, you probably experienced this yourself. You probably have hymns yourself that you like better than others. I know, I do. I've got my favorites, and then I'm going, I'm not sure I love that one so much, right? We all have these personal tastes, right? We need to understand that there was a body of people who got together and thought very carefully about how to put this together, and we need to respect what they did, right? So always, even if it's not your personal favorite, be respectful that this comes out of a very thoughtful process. Avoiding secular and sentimental influences. I'm not sure how well Sowerby would do in 2025, for instance. We have these debates all the time now about contemporary music and how that comes and plays into church and what kind of things you should. Sowerby would not have wanted that at all, because he thinks the music itself is the offering that you are giving up to God, and so it should be of the highest quality. Is the way Sowerby thinks of it. Should glorify divine authorities, finest possible craft, dignified, sober, and solemn. And I'm going to show you just a quick quote. This is from that Ideas in Church Music. The purpose in music and worship, it has been said, is to strengthen the ideas and feelings that the worshiper already has, and to release the mind from life's ordinary activities. This may be true, but it puts the accent in the wrong place on the worshiper. In reality, music and worship is essentially a part of the corporate act of worship and a direct means or approach to God. This music, then, is not primarily means for edifying or even inspiring the worshiper, but is a part of his offering to the deity. You may feel wonderful when you listen to music in church, but that's not the point. The point is that music going upward to the divine, right? For Sowerby, that's the point. Now, that's fine if you happen to feel great listening to that. That's still good. That's okay. But don't confuse these things, right? The real thing is about the quality of the music that you're offering up to God. Okay. Very quickly, I know we've got just a couple of minutes. Last thing. The other way that St. James really impacted Sowerby is that he redirected his energies toward the organ. This is fun, because nowadays, if you know Sowerby at all, you know he is an organ composer more than anything. That's the thing he is absolutely best known for. You might be surprised to learn that there was a whole decade in his life when he wrote virtually no organ music. That whole 1920s, the lost decades, so to speak, right? He wasn't writing any organ music. It's only coming here. And after he had finished writing all those canticles and masses that we talked about earlier to be sung at St. James, he turns to the organ, right? And I give you a couple of the little periods that you can divide his music into. Don't worry too much about that. The idea is that now, 1930 onward, we are going to enhance the organ repertoire here at St. James and more broadly. It's a big shift in his priorities. And it is because of this shift that Sowerby, in many ways, has the reputation that he has in modern times. Because again, he's best known to this day in the year 2025 as an organ composer. And it's thanks to his being here that all happened. Okay. One last little excerpt, musical excerpt, and then we'll be done, because I know we're running short on time. This is Toccata. Many of you happen to know this piece? I wonder, we'll listen to just a little bit of it. This is being performed by a guy named Bruce Neswick, who is one of Stephen Bussard's teachers. So we'll listen to just a little bit of this.
Leo Sowerby, Toccata.
Your finger's gonna work out. I don't know if you know what it's doing. It's not the easiest stuff to play. So with all of that said, these are just my very quick closing thoughts. Absolutely, Sowerby is among the most prolific and important American composers of sacred and organ music. I don't think there's any doubt, honestly. I mean, I'm biased because I love the guy, but I really don't think there's any doubt about this. But the reason for that is very much due to this place. And again, it was a symbiotic relationship, I think. Sowerby gave a lot to the cathedral gave a lot to Sowerby, and it led to this kind of marriage of their interests in a lot of ways. And this place remains pivotal even to this day, I think, in terms of securing Sowerby's musical legacy. You have a music director here who plays a lot of Sowerby's music, who knows as much as I do about Sowerby. He's probably going to be humble about it, but he knows a whole lot about Sowerby himself. He's a wonderful musician and advocate for this music. So people like myself who love Sowerby's music are very grateful for what you do here and the way that this space supports Sowerby and his music to this day. Thank you very much. I know we're running a little bit on time, but I'm glad to answer questions at any point.
I have a question. You mentioned that it was inspired by the English tradition, but then you said it was a Midwestern tradition.
Mm-hmm.
What is the Midwestern tradition, or what was that?
It's a more individual focus in terms of the choral sound. Probably a heavier vibrato, perhaps, than what we might think of as acceptable in terms of like an ideal choral sound. Less emphasis on these kind of like rising and falling contours in melodies, and almost more like note to note a little bit, you know what I mean, in terms of how you're approaching a musical phrase, things like that. Those might be things that we could perhaps consider like a 1930s Midwestern sound or something like that. An English choir would be much more concerned with blending the sound, reducing the vibrato probably in some ways, and keeping a more, what we might call a linear focus, so that the musical line starts at a certain point, rises, and then kind of.
So did he keep a little bit of the Midwestern tradition, or did he focus more on the English?
I mean, it was a balance, I think. And I imagine it's got to be challenging. You go and learn some tradition somewhere else, and you try to bring it back home. You always have to kind of negotiate between the people who are at home who, well, we kind of like doing things the way we do them, right? And now you've got all these kind of doing this. So I think he was constantly trying to blend the two, basically. Yeah.
You mentioned his relationship to traditional forms of church music. What was his relationship to the changes going on in the broader musical world? He was living through such a radical.
Yeah, it was fascinating. So, we talk about modernism in music. And when you say modernism in music, a lot of times what you mean is that you're trying to break from the past. You know what I mean? Okay, that's old. What we're doing is modern. Like, and, you know, the idea is that this is new. And as you say, a lot of people during Sowerby's lifetime wanted kind of a bigger break from the past. And they wanted these kind of newer sound, kind of avant-garde kind of sounding things. Sowerby was not really into that. He thought of it more as a continuity. We should still use the past and be respectful of it and build on it. Don't throw it out. Build on it. Add some maybe more colorful sounds or some more complicated things. But don't throw out everything. So he's not somebody who would have really embraced the real avant-garde kind of stuff, like they were doing in New York and Boston, for instance. Those were really the centers of that.
Yeah. Again, with Benjamin Britten, been roughly a contemporary in the English style, how would you compare the two?
Yeah, I mean, there are some similarities, aren't there? I mean, Britten is probably a more dramatic composer than Sowerby, I might say, because Britten wrote a lot of operas, for instance. Sowerby did not write operas. But I think there are some similarities in terms of they both have a basis in what we call tonality. I don't know if you know what I mean by that term, but it's music that sounds a little bit more anchored to our ears rather than super dissonant, right? They both have these kind of central elements. They both write prolifically for the church. I think church music was probably more central to Sowerby ultimately than it was to Britten, because Britten was this opera composer as well, and he's doing these other kinds of projects, and has his own kind of political views on things that were maybe different from Sowerby. But you could listen to them in tandem and find some commonalities, definitely, in terms of the chromatic musical language, but not completely dissonant or anything like that. There are certain parallels, I would say, yeah, sure. Thank you very much for your patience and for listening to all of this. I really appreciate having a chance